Oklahoma City is a weird place, but if you glance at a map, this weirdness might not jump out to you immediately. Over the past year, I've been piecing together the story of why Oklahoma City looks the way it does. And today, I'm going to share with you all of the weirdness that I've uncovered. If you've never lived in Oklahoma City, you probably don't know much about it. I grew up in Tulsa, which is only about 100 miles away, and then I lived in Norman for 5 years, which is literally within the Oklahoma City metro area. And still, I knew pretty much nothing about OKC until I actually moved here just a little over a year ago. Quick side note, a large portion of this video was based on the book Boomtown. If you like this video, I highly recommend checking this book out. Personally, I'm a big fan of audiobooks, so I'm a longtime subscriber to Audible. If you're interested, you can use the link in the description to set up an Audible account and get your first month free. This means you'll have a free audiobook credit, which you could use to listen to Boomtown. When you're signing up, make sure to use the link in the description to get that first month free. Surprisingly, our story begins right here, under this bridge. Welcome to eryngo.urbanism. This is the origin point of Oklahoma City. Most street names in the city, and there's a train. Street names throughout the city usually begin with a cardinal or ordinal direction, which indicates its relationship to this spot. As a result, the city is essentially divided into 4 quadrants. But why this point? I get why the east-west division would be the railroad tracks, which predated the city. But why is the north-south division Sheridan Avenue? It's kind of a random street named after a problematic man. We'll get into it a little bit later. Why isn't the dividing line Main Street or Reno, which actually continues far past downtown? Or even California Avenue, which perfectly bisects the Botanical Gardens, the future Thunder Arena, the Santa Fe Depot, and the Bricktown Canal. I want to draw your attention to one more tiny detail about this north-south division. If you look to the south of Sheridan, the streets are pretty closely aligned to the cardinal directions. But just to the north of Sheridan, it's kind of hard to tell, but the grid is slightly askew. This part of the grid actually aligns to the railroad track. Let's zoom out. Oklahoma City is located here at what used to be simply called Oklahoma Station, inside of this really important old border. Before the exact border was drawn, the land contained within it had been assigned to the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation as they were being forced to move here from east of the Mississippi. It's also worth noting that before that assignment, the region had been inhabited by various peoples for somewhere around 30,000 years. But by 1889, none of that apparently mattered anymore. This had become the unassigned lands, a big chunk of space in the heart of Indian territory that was unassigned from the Muskogee and Seminole peoples as punishment for providing support to the Confederacy during the Civil War. The territories were shrunk to their modern configuration further east. After redrawing these borders, the US government kept this chunk of land in case they happened to run across any more native peoples who they deemed to be getting in their way. But as most of the continent had been settled at this point, and Indian removal had been ruled unconstitutional since, well, before they did it, a group from Kansas known as the Boomers saw the unassigned lands as a challenge and began trying to occupy them illegally. Of course, they just kept getting arrested and escorted away. But after giving in to, well, actually not all that much pressure, the US government gave the okay for the unassigned lands to be settled by outsiders. You'd think they would have come up with some kind of formal process for this settlement, but they didn't. The rules were simple. Start at the border at noonish on April 22nd, 1889, and grab whatever piece of land you could get to first. However, the first people to arrive at Oklahoma Station brazenly broke that first rule. This group, known as the Sooners, arrived hours before anyone else. They began grabbing up all the best spots as quickly as they could. After the initial dust had settled, yet before any of the rule followers had arrived, a subgroup of the Sooners known as the Seminole Town Improvement Company began coordinating a street grid, which they aligned to the railroad tracks. Another group, known as the Oklahoma Town Company, made the mistake of mostly following the rules. They also planned to lay out the OKC grid, but when they arrived, the STIC had already done most of the job. The OTC ended up laying out their own grid anyways, just to the south. When the two grids met up, they realized that they were entirely incompatible. Of course, it's hardly noticeable these days, but a lot of the streets have to make very slight bends right around where these two grids met up. That borderline where north met south was, you guessed it, Grand Avenue. Wait, what? There is no Grand Avenue in Oklahoma City. Well, there was, until they renamed it to Sheridan Avenue in the 1960s. Why did they do that? Well, surprisingly, we'll get back to that later. While there might not be a Grand Avenue anymore, there is a Grand Boulevard right here. Wait, it's also here and here and here? Okay, so what's up with that? It all goes back to this map from 1910. This, as the very ornate title block suggests, is the general plan of the outer parkway for Oklahoma City and a plan for an interior system of parks and boulevards. I mean, I'm sold. Only a couple of decades after the whole STIC OTC downtown grid debacle, this map was one of the first attempts to create a unified plan to connect and beautify an otherwise fragmented, haphazard city that was born out of chaos. At the time this plan was drawn, Oklahoma had only been a state for 3 years, and the capital was just moving here from Guthrie. The plan was simple and elegant. Create a series of parks around the city and connect them to each other with a grand loop boulevard. Diagonal parkways could also stretch outward from the city center to connect people in the city to this major loop route. And actually, in the coming decades, a significant portion of this plan actually took shape. Developers such as John Wilford Chartel and Anton H. Klassen quickly bought into the idea, constructing streetcars along many of the plan's diagonal boulevards that were beginning to take shape. But then, things took a turn for the cars. The famous Route 66 made its way through OKC in 1929. Its original alignment came down from Edmond to the state capital before winding through the city streets and heading off toward Bethany and Yukon in the west. Other early highways that passed through the city were treated the same way. The routes simply borrowed existing city streets, directing droves of interstate traffic through the heart of the city. This obviously had its drawbacks when it came to local congestion, but one of the reasons Route 66 is still so romanticized to this day is because it was both a journey and a destination. To this day, many of the most vibrant and eclectic streetscapes in the city fall along this original Route 66 alignment. It was, in a sense, truly the Mother Strode. But at some point, Oklahoma's Department of Transportation made the fairly wise decision to separate the highway traffic from the local traffic. As new separated highways were being laid out, many segments of the original Grand Boulevard right-of-way were converted instead to massive highways. As a result, OKC's Grand Boulevard of today is a bit of an obscure vestigial relic. I mean, it doesn't even have its own Wikipedia page. Most of it looks like a highway access road, but in a few places, the boulevard was untouched by highway expansion. And recently, OKC's planners have been reprioritizing this corridor, and the city is fairly close to reconnecting the original Grand Boulevard loop with a multi-use path that will soon fully encircle the core of the city. One thing that has really caught my attention about OKC since moving here is the amount of vacant land all around the city center. And a lot of it comes back to this map. Back in the 1930s, these parts of the city were deemed best, and these parts of the city were deemed hazardous. The intent of this map was to communicate mortgage lending risk based on the quality of housing, sales and rental rates, land quality, and population of the neighborhood. And it's that last point that really gets at why this is sinister. This, as you may have already guessed, is the practice known as redlining. The areas in red were, and in many cases still are, the parts of the city where predominant populations of non-white residents live. If a city planning commission creates an official map that specifically outlines areas where investment could supposedly incur a hazardous amount of risk, of course a conservative lender is going to divert their funds elsewhere and turn down anyone looking to build nice things anywhere in these zones. Maps like these in cities all around the country began a trend of generational disinvestment in these neighborhoods, which in many cases continues to this day. This map also created a perfect runway for white flight. As you can probably extrapolate, the primary trajectory of this upcoming explosive suburban development pattern in OKC would be to the northwest. As more and more middle and upper class people packed their cars, left downtown, and headed northwest throughout the 40s and 50s, the now half-century-old downtown buildings that they were abandoning began to fall into disrepair. The city was starting to look old and gross, especially from the window of a car speeding down the freeway. One such building, which had once been one of the crown jewels of the OKC skyline, was located right here
on Sheridan Avenue. See, I told you we'd be back.
Oklahoma City's Biltmore Hotel was built on the corner of Harvey and Grand Avenue in the 1930s. But by the era of white flight, the hotel was beginning to fall into disrepair. In fact, the rest of Grand Avenue wasn't looking much grander. It was at this moment in time that the property was acquired by Sheraton, who invested $1 million into renovating and modernizing the building.
The city was so excited about all of this investment from Sheraton, they actually renamed Grand Avenue to Sheridan Avenue.
They actually wanted to go all in and call it Sheraton Avenue, but they figured that'd be a bit too on the nose. Instead, they pretended they were naming it to honor Philip Sheridan, who, yeah, he said that.
So it might be about time to come up with a new name for this street. Tulsa, you're not off the hook either.
Anyways, the big takeaway was that the decline of downtown in the mid-20th century was palpable, and the city planners were trying to come up with anything and everything they could do to reimagine the city and get people interested in it once again. As a part of this effort, Oklahoma City brought in visionary modernist architect I.M. Pei to develop a new master plan for downtown OKC. His plan turned out to be incredibly ambitious. It involved building lots of office towers, retail developments, parking garages, a convention center, botanical gardens, a Main Street indoor shopping mall. And the first step was to demolish, well, just about everything. And sure, maybe that sounds a bit extreme to you and to me. But in the 60s and 70s, while downtown was beginning to decline, Oklahoma City's economy on the whole was seemingly thriving. New developments were popping up on the outskirts of the city every year, and the discovery of massive oil reservoirs led to jobs and prosperity all around central Oklahoma. In fact, at this mall, northwest of downtown, there was a bank that would write a check to pretty much anyone who they thought might strike it big in oil. So it's not too much of a surprise that people were largely supportive of the pay plan at first. After all, a thriving city should surely have a thriving downtown. People had grown accustomed to a suburban lifestyle. So why not bring the best of these suburban amenities into downtown itself? The city quickly began blowing up acres of its historic structures to make way for a new era. But then, two things happened.
The first thing took place right here. Pei's plan called for a demolition of a lot of buildings in Oklahoma City. However, it did not call for the demolition of the Biltmore Hotel or other historic landmarks in the city. However, in 1973, only 12 years after the Sheraton remodel, the Biltmore Hotel was deemed useless and it was demolished in a spectacular explosion. Demolitions in Oklahoma City had become pretty routine at that point, but a demolition that was so high profile as the Biltmore Hotel really made people start to question whether or not all this destruction was really worthwhile. To some people, this was Pei's plan taken a step too far.
The second thing happened here at the Penn Square Bank. You know all of those checks I mentioned they were writing? By the late 1970s, it had become clear that they were overextending their resources. And after the oil crisis of 1979, Penn Square Bank was on its last legs. It became insolvent in 1982, leaving the economy of Oklahoma City and beyond in shambles. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, not much happened here. The pay plan was put on pause due to lack of funding, meaning that blocks and blocks of bulldozed urban land now sat vacant all around the city.
Enter MAPS. MAPS stands for Metropolitan Area Projects.
The original pitch of MAPS was fairly simple. A penny sales tax that would be used to fund a large variety of different civic projects in and around downtown OKC.
See, MAPS was kind of a continuation of the implementation process of the pay plan, except that this time, the people of Oklahoma City would actually get to vote for it. I know, crazy, right? And it's been largely responsible for most of the major public improvement projects that the city has done in the past couple of decades, including the Oklahoma City streetcar.
At the time MAPS was envisioned, downtown had been neglected for decades, then bulldozed, then neglected for decades more. It was really not somewhere that anyone wanted to be. 2 years after the first version of MAPS was voted for, downtown Oklahoma City was bombed. To this day, the OKC bombing is still one of the deadliest terrorist attacks on US soil. At 9:02 a.m. on April 19th, 1995, exactly 3 days before OKC's 106th birthday, a truck exploded right here next to the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. 168 people lost their lives. The city was at rock bottom. There was a serious need to come together, to begin the process of recovering and healing from all of the damage that had been done. In the wake of the bombing, an advisory panel was assembled by the Urban Land Institute. This panel included 13 influential planning, urban design, and real estate leaders from around the country. They convened in Oklahoma City to provide recommendations on an approach the city should take with regards to healing the built environment. The recommendations of this panel played a significant role in reshaping the vision of MAPS. Bricktown, for example, was a part of this vision, and MAPS provided funding for some of its biggest elements, such as the ballpark and the canal. Oklahoma City is a weird place, and sure, there's still a lot of things we need to do in order to make it better. But who knows? If we continue to come together and push for incremental improvements, maybe by the end of the 21st century, OKC will even be a great city.
However, a truly great city needs truly great bike infrastructure, and if you're planning on exploring the city anytime soon by bike, unfortunately, I have to recommend you choose another mode of transportation. If you're curious why, you need to watch this video here. Well, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can actually watch our next video right now over on Patreon. The link is in the description. Go check it out.
Patrons, I want to give you a big thanks for always helping me make these videos. You all rock.